Most likely, unless you've read some pretty extensive books, you probably haven't heard this story before. So if you have questions, just wait till the end, and you can ask me anything you want. You can like your shoe size if you really feel like it. So, a little bit about me. I published a book a few years ago called Piercing the Head of Quality. It's meant for your guys' age, so you guys can understand it a little more. It's going through its second process right now. So in about 2 weeks, I'll be giving my second humongous booklet of papers to some people in Washington, D.C., and they're going to look over it, and then a new edition will be coming out. But I did most of my research in D.C. at Ford's Theater. You can still go through the theater today and look at all through the facts and stuff that was used throughout the entire process, which I'll talk about today. And yes, that is an embarrassing picture of me, but that is the gun that John Wilkes Booth used to kill Abraham Lincoln. Nowadays we have these humongous guns, and you know, just imagine what that little tiny thing did to the country. So just keep that in mind. So first of all, I'll talk about John Wilkes Booth and his background. He was born May 10th, 1838, to a Junius Brutus Booth and Mary Ann Holmes. Now, if you're wondering why they don't have the first name, or same last name, is because Junius was actually an actor in London, and Mary Ann Holmes was a flower girl across the street, and they fell in love. That sounds all great and everything, but in the mid-20s, they ended up coming to the United States, thinking that they could find a better life for themselves. And unfortunately, it took about 10 years for Junius's wife back in London to find out that he had an affair. And so for 10 years, his wife was actually sending him checks thinking that he was going big in New York City, and of course he really wasn't. But he did a lot of mischief things, and at this time, John was already born. He was the 9th of 10 children. So if you can imagine, they had 10 children before his wife found out. Nowadays, that's kind of weird. Back then, it was kind of weird, but still, very, very interesting. So after they got an official divorce, Mary Ann Holmes and Junius Brutus Booth ended up getting married, coincidentally on John's 13th birthday. So John was always the favorite child, and this is where they grew up, Tudor Hall. It's a 150-acre plot outside of Baltimore. It's still there today. You can still go visit it. This is basically where Booth grew up, learned most of his stuff about acting, because his family was a bunch of actors. I mean, the majority of his family were in the acting business. And so when he was a child, he read a lot of Shakespeare and Romeo and Juliet and that kind of stuff. I mean, nowadays, you guys don't like to read that stuff, do you? It's kind of lame. Yeah. Well, that's basically all he had to look at. And so he knew every single play by the age of 16. So if you said, hey, John, we're going to need you to play Romeo today, he said, I got it. He knew every single line by heart to every single play that he was reading. So he was very, very popular, and a lot of people wanted him to come act. And basically, he came up through the ranks, and I like to say this because I know it, is in with your guys' generation, but he was kind of like an early Justin Bieber, ideally. He was really, really big in the United States. And so he started developing, he started working a lot more with Shakespeare, and started getting a lot more famous. And he got his first role in 1858 in the Philadelphia Arch Street Theater. And he played Earl of Richmond and Richard III. You guys probably don't know anything about that, but it was a pretty big play back in the day. And so at this point, after Philadelphia, he really started going up. People were asking him to go to Cincinnati, St. Louis, Baltimore, and a lot of northern cities. What I'll explain to you is, during the Civil War and during this time, he didn't really travel down in the South, because if you can imagine, the South was so worried about trying to get armor and trying to build things and make sure that other soldiers has everything. So they didn't have time for acting. In the North, the wealthy just basically went on with their lives. They sent people to go fight for them if they needed to, and they didn't have to worry about anything. So they went to plays, which is why Booth made a lot of money during the Civil War. But of course, he finds love life. That's always a story. At one time, Booth actually had at least over 20 girlfriends at one time. Of course, they didn't have Facebook or Twitter, so no one knew exactly how many he had. But he'd always carry pictures of women with him. And when he was found dead, he was found with 3 pictures of one different women and one of her. Her name was Lucy Lambert Hale. She was the one that John really liked the most, opened up to her and basically knew everything about. She was a senator's daughter from New Hampshire. And she had a little interesting background with Lincoln and with the Booth family. At one point, she was dancing with Robert Todd Lincoln, Lincoln's oldest son, at a party that John and her went to. And of course, we don't really know exactly if that's really why Booth hated Lincoln so much, but nothing to speculate. And another instance between the Booths and Lincolns and her is that she and Edwin Booth, his older brother, were at a train station, and of course, Robert Todd Lincoln again seems to be in a lot of trouble all these times. Falls onto the tracks outside of Baltimore, and Edwin Booth grabs him off the tracks and saves his life. Now, Lincoln sends him a letter, and I'm glad to say that Booth never actually saw that. John Wilkes Booth never saw that letter, because I'm sure if he did, he'd be very, very upset, because it basically just said, "Thank you for saving my son." And at this time, Lincoln was not very popular with the Southern folk, especially with John. So you can imagine how much hatred he would have had for his brother. So at the start of the Civil War, basically John doesn't really know what to do. He said he can't fight in the war because he made a promise to his mother saying he wouldn't fight. And of course his mother, I'm sure all mothers, they care about their children, and she basically said, yeah, you're not going to fight. So instead of fighting, he tried to find different ways. Smuggling, working with Confederate sympathizers, and once the South seceded, his home state of Maryland was a border state. So ideally he could have went northern or southern. But he decided to go with his Confederate ideals, and that's what he really, he wanted the Confederate way. And so while he was acting, he would actually spend most of his time up in Canada. That sounds really weird, but if you can think about it, there was a lot of southern here, obviously, and there was a lot of southern people up here. Now, the reason why is Canada was a hot spot. Basically, you can go up to Canada and no one would find you, because basically the Confederates would just hide you and allow you to do everything you want. So Booth would go up there and talk to people and learn about a lot of things, and up there is where they actually came up with plans to assassinate Lincoln before John had plans. They wanted to blow up the White House. They actually had a guy who was a bombing expert, and they planted a bunch of explosives in the White House, but they never went off. There's also an instance where they tried to taint the water system in New York to kill everybody. That didn't work either. And then there was another one where they tried to put yellow fever in Lincoln's collar, so he could contract yellow fever and die. But they couldn't get to that either. So Booth was in the midst of all this big hype about trying to kill Lincoln this entire time. And towards the end of the Civil War, Richmond's falling, the South is falling. The North has a lot of POWs, the prisoners of war. So basically, John says, you know what, we're going to need to get these guys back if we want to win. And so the original idea was to kidnap Lincoln and exchange him for prisoners of war that the North had. And the original plan was developed in 1864, the year before he was assassinated. And they would meet up at a woman's house, and they basically just talk about it, and they said, you know what, let's just go and kidnap him at Soldier's Home. Soldier's Home is a second home of Lincoln's. It's basically a summer home where he goes out and hangs out. He doesn't want to be with all the nastiness that Washington is. And there are a few times where he's actually almost killed, not by Booth's men, but by other people. But the one instance that Booth actually sent out people, they waited outside Soldier's Home for about 2 days. Unfortunately, Lincoln never showed up. He showed up about a week later. So Lincoln really dodged a bullet there. And so after that, Booth really saw to himself, we just got to move to black flag warfare. That's what they referred to it as back then. That's basically murder. They said the best way we can do is just eliminate them all. Well, at this time, in 1864, going into 1865, not a lot of people liked Lincoln. if you can imagine today, we put him on our penny and our $5 bill, and he's got monuments and everything. Back then, he really wasn't as popular as he is today. You can imagine there's two sides of the story. So the Southern folks really didn't like him. They thought he was a tyrant. That's somebody who oppresses others, doesn't allow them to do what they want to do. And the one big thing that I found is that he suspended habeas corpus. Now that sounds like gibberish to you guys, but basically what it is like I can say, you're wearing a Nebraska shirt. I'm a big Iowa fan. I might as well just arrest you because I don't like Nebraska. So that's basically what it is. And they would just they would take people off the streets and arrest them because if they were doing anything Southern, get them off the streets. And actually, that did help following the assassination because if you can imagine, hundreds of people going on the streets, they just grab anyone off the street and they question them. So that's that's how they find a bunch of the conspirators. But originally, it was thought it was a bad idea because basically just arrested people and people are being detained for about a month for no reason. So at this time, they're talking about murder. He's got to have some help. Of course, he can't do this all by himself. So he has 7 men and 1 woman to help him do this. We have John Surratt. He's 21 years old at the time. He's a courier for the South. Basically, he just sends messages from the North and the South up into Canada, where he spends most of his time, like I said. Samuel Arnold. He's just basically a childhood friend of the Booths. Not really much to do with this entire conspiracy, but he's basically the one that makes appointments and make sure Booth is where he needs to be at certain times. George Adsterat, he's a German immigrant who worked at the blockade on the Potomac, so he basically dictated who was going to go through the Potomac for the South. And so he would be one of the major conspirators. I'll name them off if they're really big. Yeah, Michael O'Laughlin, he was the guy that was actually at Soldiers' Home waiting for Lincoln to come. And after that, his really actions kind of declined with Booth, and he didn't really have much big of a role. He basically did the same thing as Arnold did, just basically doing appointment times, making sure everything goes okay. Yeah, Lewis Powell, he's another of the big conspirators. He is a soldier from the South, and he is very tall. He's about 6'4", 6'5". So if you can imagine, back then that is very, very tall. And he actually fought in Gettysburg. It's kind of funny how he gets out of it. He hurt his wrist. He's a big old guy, and he hurts his wrist when he fell or got shot. And so, he's kind of suspicious to the South. Exactly like, why did you leave at this time? David Harold, I like to call him basically the doctor, because he went to Georgetown College, which is basically Georgetown University today, where he got his medical degree. So he knew in and everything out with medical, and he also knew a lot of the roads in Virginia, which is what they're going to need, because when they're escaping, they got to have someone who knows all the routes, and that was basically his job. And then you got Mary Surratt. If you guys have seen or heard about the movie The Conspirator, just came out a couple years ago. Basically, it's about her and her trial through this entire. It's a really, really long and really boring movie, honestly. But she basically owned a boarding house where all these guys would meet, but she also owned a tavern, which I'll bring up later, which is important as well. So, all these were arrested eventually, but I'll talk about that when it gets to the time. So, at this time, Booth and his conspirators think to themselves, why just assassinate the president? Might as well assassinate the top 3 members of the government. Because at that point, you've really shut down the government. You can imagine nowadays if someone were to assassinate the president, vice president, and then the secretary of state, and Speaker of the House, a lot of problems would happen in our government. So they thought this is the best way to do it. And of course, they had all the people, and they thought to themselves, well, they're all going to be in D.C. at this time, so let's just focus on these guys. So we got, obviously, President Abraham Lincoln, Vice President Andrew Johnson, and the Secretary of State, William H. Seward. Now, the reason why they picked Seward is because back then, the Secretary of State is actually the 3rd in line. Nowadays, it's the Speaker of the House, but back then it was him. So, Booth calls up on Lewis Powell and says, you know what, you're big, you're strong, you're going to have to get through this house, because he's in a house upstairs in a bedroom, and he's laying down, he's been hurt. About a month earlier, he'd gotten into a carriage accident and broken his jaw. And of course, nowadays you can basically just go to, get surgery. But back then they had to, basically sedate you and make you be in bed for about a month. And he had a metal jaw put in his neck, which would actually save his life later. So Powell arrives at the house, knocks on the door and says, servant, I have a package for the secretary here. And the servant says, what are you doing at 10:30 at night? And he goes, well, I was instructed by the physician, and he's like, don't worry about it, I'll take it. And of course, Powell says, well, I'm not going to go out like this. So he stabs the servant, runs up the stairs, and he sees Frederick Seward's son. And Frederick is hearing this commotion. He's wondering, who was at my house at 10:30 at night? This is not really that normal. So he walks out and sees Powell right upstairs. Powell pulls his revolver and shoots. Unfortunately, there was no bullets in it. So if you can imagine, he was a soldier, but he was not smart enough to actually load his pistol. And this is the actual pistol that he used. And so, of course, his next instinct without having bullets was just basically pistol whip him. And that's what he did. He smacked him over the head with the butt of the gun several times and ended up basically fracturing his skull. And Frederick would not die, but he would have immense brain swelling and would never really recover. So after that, he's thinking to himself, like, how cool do I have to get through to get to the secretary? And of course, he finds the room where the secretary is at, opens the door, sees another servant, has to stab him, and then sees Fanny Seward, the secretary's daughter. And of course, back then they respected women, and so he didn't stab her, just kind of pushed her aside. And as she's going to scream, and Powell gets on top of the secretary and starts stabbing him repeatedly in the neck. Now, he's going for the jugular vein. Now, the jugular vein is basically a one-shot hit, and that's basically, he knows that because of his time in the military. Well, remember I said earlier about that metal plate that was in his neck? It was covering the jugular vein. So when he was going, he just kept on stabbing and stabbing and stabbing, and all it kept on hitting was metal. So in a way, the metal actually saved his life. But you'd think after 12 or 13 stabs that Powell would have just gone on to the other part of the face or the chest or anything. Well, he didn't. He thought he had done his work, gets up, runs out, and stabs another servant to leave the house. And then when he gets outside, he throws his dagger, and he's waiting for David Harold, the guy I mentioned earlier, who's basically the doctor. Well, David Harold was supposed to be there waiting for him. And David Harold got really scared and ended up running away with their horses. So, of course, now Powell's basically walking around D.C. by himself, and he's getting really, really worried. He's like, well, people are going to pick me up. I'm just walking around at 10:30 at night. So he ends up going to Mary Surratt's house, and that was his plan B. His plan was to go there in case something happened, and just be like, I'm going to dig a ditch for you in the morning. That's just what our story's going to be. Well, at that time, Mary was actually being talked to by the cops, because this is later on in the night after Lincoln had been assassinated. So they actually go to her house, and Powell knocks on the door, and two Union officers open the door and say, "What are you doing here at night?" And he goes, "I'm here to dig a ditch for her. I wanted to get started early in the morning." And they bring Mary Surratt in, and according to Mary Surratt, she didn't know who he was. She claims that it was too dark, and she couldn't really see who it was. So of course, Powell was arrested, and that's how they find out that he actually tried to assassinate the secretary. The next one is
can I say, and then it's kind of interesting. Are you going to say later, like, what Seward ends up doing? Are you
Yes.
talking the same? Okay, you said that. Okay, great.
If you're going to say it now, Seward actually survives.
Yeah.
He ends up just with massive facial scars, but he ends up being okay. He ends up doing his job. Nothing really happens after that.
I was thinking, is he the same one who bought Alaska? Like Seward's Folly, they call. I think it was. I think he brokered that deal with Russia by Alaska, and everybody made fun of him and called it
I think that
Seward's
was him,
Folly
actually. Yeah.
and Seward's Icebox, but it was the greatest purchase anybody could have made, knowing all the resources in Alaska.
Yeah,
So that's pretty.
he really didn't decline after his assassination.
Isn't that something? Wow, I didn't know he was ever, I had no idea that other part of the story. Wow. Are you guys following that? You know, the Secretary of State, like today, is John Kerry, who just got it in there from Hillary Clinton, an advisor to the president about how to handle those foreign relations. Remember that game we played with the chips?
Yeah.
All right, so Seward would have been the head of all of those people negotiating that. And so what a high, important position, but I had no idea about that he was, had that assassination attempt. Did you guys know that?
No.
But are you following what Matt's saying? Okay.
Yes.
Well, I can tell. I think you guys are. That's great.
And you know what, the weird thing is that the ones that I mentioned, they all happened on the same night. So they all happened on April 14th.
The same night when Lincoln was assassinated.
Yep.
So all these people came together. I did not know that either.
And so that night was not over, not even close to over. The next one that was supposed to be assassinated was Vice President Andrew Johnson. He was sitting at the Kirkwood House, which is basically your upscale embassy suites today, and he had the easiest job. You know, basically all he had to do was go knock on the door that Johnson was at and stab him or shoot him. I mean, back then they had an open door policy, which actually ended up hurting Lincoln the most, is because basically you could walk up to the White House and knock on the front door and say, Mr. Lincoln, you having for dinner tonight? And if they didn't, they would say, yeah, sure, why don't you have dinner with us? That really changed after McKinley's assassination when they really started getting like the Secret Service. But this is the same thing for Johnson. He didn't have any really bodyguards at his hotel. You know, no one really thought anyone would try to assassinate him. I mean, the last time they tried to assassinate someone was mid-1800s, Andrew Jackson. So really, they weren't too worried about it. But unfortunately, George Astaroth was very, very weak, had a weak conscience. He ended up getting drunk and not assassinated the vice president. He would later be found about 6 days later at someone's house. They ended up following just a bunch of links and finding him. But he could have assassinated the vice president. He was there at the hotel, and he saw Johnson walk by. All he had to do was just confront him. But he was really, really scared, and that's why he started drinking and getting drunk instead. So if you imagine, they dodged the bullet there. And then, of course, you got Lincoln's assassination. So all this has happened at the same night. Basically what happened was earlier that morning, Booth had heard that Lincoln was supposed to be coming to Ford's Theater. But he'd also heard that he was supposed to be going to Grover's Theater, another theater that night, which was showing Aladdin. So he wasn't really sure whether or not who to believe, but he asked the owner of Ford's Theater, is he really coming tonight? Oh, he's like, yeah, we received the telegram and everything. So he's okay, well, let's go tonight, and that's when he initiates everybody's plot to kill everybody. So he hears this, he gets ready, goes back to his hotel, and he gets ready to do the unthinkable. That night, they would be showing Our American Cousin, basically, play. I don't know much about the play, but that night was supposed to be Laura Keene. She's an actress back then. This was going to be her 1,000th performance. So very, very big. And of course, when people hear that the president's coming, everyone wants to see. So Booth thinks to himself, this is a great idea. Everyone's going to see what I've done. And so this is a modern day picture of Ford's Theater. So basically, Booth starts to walk around the bottom edge. And of course, he's walking around and no one really thinks of anything. It would just be like a teacher walking around the hall. I mean, it's just a teacher. Not really going to worry about it. And so he has a free access to get up there. And he gets up to the box, and there's an empty chair. He's wondering to himself, oh, this is really weird. But John Parker, the guard that was supposed to be there, was actually one of the worst police officers they had in Washington. He had arrested tons of people, he was very, very drunk and lazy. And so instead of actually watching the president that night, he actually went downstairs and watched the play while drinking. So some people think that he had something to do with it, but ideally what we know is that he just was really stupid. I mean, that's just basically what it is. And so Booth is thinking to himself, wow, this is a great idea. I have no one with me. So he enters the first door, And back then they had a door and then another door to get into the president's box. And so he gets to the second door, and he looks through a little peephole that he had drilled in earlier that day, knowing that Lincoln was going to be there. And he sees 4 people. And he thinks, wow, well, that's weird. Well, originally, the Grants were supposed to be there that night with Lincoln. Unfortunately, the Grants had turned it down because they had to go to Philadelphia.
And they don't probably know anything about Ulysses S. Grant, just so that they know he's the very famous general who helped win the Civil War.
Basically, Grant is the guy who signed the paper that said we win. That's basically what his job was. Very, very famous, and you'll hear his name a lot through your schooling. So, and plus he's on our $50 bill. I mean, I don't have $50 anytime, so. But if I ever get one, that's who's on it. So, but instead of the Grants being there, they invite 2 other people, their friends, just regular friends. The weird thing about it is that the 2 that they invited are actually getting married, and they're step siblings. So it's kind of weird. I mean, I wouldn't really want to marry my stepsister. It's kind of weird. So, but he looks through it, and he opens the door. He pulls back his gun. This one. And his adrenaline's rushing. This is it. This is what he's been waiting for. And he creeps up behind and shoots Lincoln in the back of the head. Oh goodness!
Can you go back?
Shoots Lincoln in the back of the head. Yeah. Oh well.
Yep. There you go.
Shoots Lincoln in the back of the head, and the bullet goes through the left part of his head and ends up behind his right eye. Now he doesn't die right away. You think that would, he would die just because it's a blunt force trauma to the head. Unfortunately, he actually survives until about 7:22 the next morning. So he's very unconscious, but I did my basically senior thesis on a doctor who helped him, and basically he was 23 years old. Now I can't imagine, I'm only 21 years old, but I can't imagine holding the president's head while he's dying. And so, very, very traumatic for him, but he is the first one that actually helped Lincoln. So back at the theater, Lincoln is, slouched over. People are a little curious, why is someone screaming, the president's been shot? And then, just literally seconds later, Booth jumps off the 12-stage balcony, or 12-foot balcony, and lands and breaks his left leg. It's not every day you see someone, jumping off the balcony in the middle of a play. So many are very, very suspicious. Many don't understand what's going on. And so,
and didn't he yell something?
He runs across the stage and he holds up his dagger and he says, "Sic semper tyrannis, the South is avenged." Basically what Sic semper tyrannis means is, thus always the tyrants. That's what they thought Lincoln was. And it's also the state motto of Virginia, which holds the capital of the Confederacy, which is Richmond. I know that was a little long-winded there. But at this time, there was a ton of Union officers in there that had guns. And I try to say that they had an opportunity, but we, as social science people, we like to call it the bystander effect. Basically, people were waiting for other people to do something, and eventually just got to the line where I was like, well, I guess no one really did anything. So he exits the theater, actually, and ends up going to Surratt's Tavern. That's the next goal. And so, this is D.C. Right outside here is the Navy Bridge Yard. Now back then they actually had a curfew. You couldn't pass past, I think it was 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock, and without coming back within the same night. So of course when they get there, the guard says, you're not going to be able to come back over. And they say, that's totally fine, whatever. So Booth and Harold meet up outside, and they end up crossing. And they head towards Surratt's Tavern. Now, remember I said about she owned the boarding house? Well, yeah, she also owned a tavern as well, where they would pick up 2 Spencer carbines and some alcohol. Because, of course, back then they didn't have Tylenol. It was just basically you drink yourself until the pain goes away. And so that's really where people really start finding out who it really was. After leaving Surratt's Tavern, or just as he's leaving, he says, "I think we've killed the president." And that person that heard that ends up reporting it, and that's how they really kind of tracked on to Booth and Harold. And so the next objective is to go to Dr. Mudd's house. Now, If you've ever heard the expression, running your name through mud, that's where this comes from. Basically, he was a doctor during the Civil War, didn't really see much action, but he knew Booth and Harold. Booth and Harold had actually talked to him beforehand, said we might be showing up, we might need a place to stay. Well, of course, they show up and he's got a broken leg, so they're going to have to fix it. And so they spend the night there. Mudd actually gives them crutches and fixes Booth's leg. And they end up going the next day to Samuel Cox's house, where he's a high-ranking Union official, and basically he's gonna basically give them a boat, because they obviously, you can't